Okay, so uh, we've been invited to talk about mixed method synthesis, and we're going to introduce some of the perspectives from the EPPI Centre, so the Evidence for Policy and Practice Information and Coordinating Centre in UCL. And what we're going to talk through today are some of the reasons around why we conduct a mixed method synthesis, what exactly we mean by mixed method synthesis, some of the frameworks that we can draw on for synthesizing different types of evidence, and then we're going to focus a little bit more on two synthesis methods that we are advocates of, so qualitative comparative analysis, QCA, and intervention component analysis, ICA, before just drawing some quick conclusions. We've been quite ambitious for the content of this session, so we may speed up at some points, but hopefully we can get through everything and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end as well. So just to begin with, so we work a lot around evidence synthesis and systematic reviews, and a lot of the systematic reviews we have traditionally conducted have involved the synthesis of randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. And RCTs are really highly valued because they can help us develop a strong causal narrative. And this is a strong causal narrative because we can be fairly certain that when we've got an RCT and we've got a random allocation of an intervention versus a control group or another type of intervention, that the reason why we're seeing a difference is because of the intervention effect itself. We have that strong counterfactual. And the synthesis of different randomized controlled trials provides even further strong evidence that of this effect. And when we've got this type of evidence to synthesize, our review questions can help us develop a really kind of strong causal narrative, but in some ways it's quite a simple set of questions. So our review questions revolve around how often do we see the effect of interest, how large is the magnitude of the effect size, and how consistent is that effect across different trials. And this can provide compelling evidence, and it can be very useful for certain review questions. We saw this throughout the COVID pandemic. So, for example, in terms of face masks and whether face masks work, and they can revolve around a simple mechanism. They represent a barrier for the transmission and for preventing infection with COVID-19. So it essentially puts a block on the respiratory system, stops COVID from entering or leaving the respiratory system. And some studies, some reviews addressed this exact question of efficacy. They explored, using studies like RCTs, they explored whether masks worked in helping to protect people from contracting or spreading the virus. But one of the things that we do at the EPPI Centre is that we work very closely with policymakers, and as our acronym suggests, we try to provide evidence for policy and practice. And what we tend to find is that this kind of question around do masks work is of interest to policymakers, but what's of more interest to policymakers is around an extension around, well, how do I implement masks? And how can we move from understanding the action of a barrier, which is masks, to contracting or spreading COVID, to a policy that uses that barrier. So we can think of wearing a mask as being quite a simple intervention, but where complexity comes in is around designing a policy around the implementation of that intervention. And we know from experience that implementing a policy around masking was definitely not a simple intervention. So we've got, for example, we've got health promotion aspects. We saw there's a circle there with UCL's health promotion around reminders to wear masks. We've got some of the steps in terms of implementing a mask policy. And we also had all sorts of unpredictable emergent outcomes coming through the pandemic. We had people who would refuse to wear masks. We had movements that were anti-mask movements that were really difficult to maybe theorize at the beginning of the pandemic. And these types of policy questions often involve elements of complexity. And some of the properties of complex interventions include things like interventions that are less predictable, where there's lots of heterogeneity, where the causal pathways are less well understood, that involve long pathways, where exact replication of an intervention is rare and the interventions may differ slightly between each other. And so this creates challenges, welcome challenges, I should say, for evidence synthesists. And we, in our experience at the EPPI Centre, have found that it's challenging if we rely only on conventional approaches for ascertaining effectiveness for synthesizing these types of complex interventions and the types of complex questions that policymakers ask of us. And there's an example quote here from a review conducted by Alison O'Mara-Eves and colleagues at the EPPI Centre around their experiences of trying to synthesize community engagement interventions, and the complexity around that intervention model, and then the complexity around different populations and settings. And what we're starting to think about really is that these types of complex questions really spur us to look at different methods for synthesis, and the questions change from looking at how often or reliable or large a given effect is, because there isn't essentially a single effect. Instead, we look at questions that are focused more on explanation and understanding. So questions, for example, around why do we see a particular effect in a given context, or what is driving differences in outcomes between studies. And so this is just on the right here, we've got an example of a comprehensive mixed method synthesis of community engagement interventions that we can signpost you to later. But Katie's going to take over now and talk a bit more about what we mean by mixed method synthesis.
Thanks, Dylan. So here at the top of the slide is a very simple definition from a colleague of ours, Quan Hong, which she has since problematized, and I'll touch a bit on that in further slides. This idea she posed in 2017 as systematic reviews combining qualitative and quantitative evidence, or how we would define mixed method synthesis. But as Dylan has been describing, this is an endeavour that's really been driven by needing to respond to policymaker questions and concerns. But I think what's useful about this kind of definition of this combination of qualitative and quantitative evidence, that it's not just the different types of evidence that we're bringing together this evidence that's grounded in diverse philosophical and epistemological understandings of what we can know and what's important to know about the world. So they look at a phenomenon from different angles, and they also allow us to bring together this kind of very macro view, these high-level patterns in behaviours or outcomes, with a much more micro, rich, contextually bound experience of that phenomenon. And I should just say at this point, you may be familiar with the ideas, but I may see in the literature that there's various labels for this kind of review. So here's another example. Dylan's already shared one, but in particular, this was a review examining weight management programs for reducing overweight and obesity. And the description here for this piece of work is about two linked systematic reviews, with one focusing on the views of those people who use weight management services or view synthesis, and another focusing on the effectiveness of those kinds of interventions. And we used the use of view synthesis to supply a theory which enabled us to structure our effectiveness synthesis, which was a qualitative comparative analysis that Dylan's going to tell a bit more about later on. But it's sort of a useful example for illustrating the bringing together of these two sets of evidence, and a little bit around what we're doing, how we're using the qualitative evidence to represent a middle range theory of the intervention, to bring this participatory or democratic perspective in, and to provide this kind of insider understanding of how the intervention works. And the roots of mixed method evidence synthesis come from work in the field of mixed methods primary research, and it's a really nice description of this mixed methods endeavour from one of the seminal papers on the techniques. So this idea of combining qualitative and quantitative research techniques, methods, approaches and concepts into a single study, or in our case, a single synthesis or review. And the kind of whole philosophy behind it is legitimating the use of multiple approaches in answering our research questions, rather than restricting or constraining to a single approach. So there's some idea of it being expansive and creative in terms of a form of research, and also being inclusive, pluralistic and complementary. So taking this idea of an eclectic approach to selecting methods and evidence and bringing it all together to see a problem from multiple angles. And just coming back to Kwan Na Hong, we were really fortunate that she was able to come visit us at the EPPI Centre a few years back and spent some time with us, seeking to undertake a case study to describe the rationales for and approaches to mixed method synthesis by the EPPI Centre in this programme of work that we conduct for the UK Department of Health, or England Department of Health and Social Care. And key factor in her findings was that it was looking at the range of work that we'd done kind of in this space, expanded or extended her understanding of what is meant by mixed methods. So she said one challenge when conducting this case study was it really forced her to redefine and reconceptualize an understanding of mixed method reviews. And this is because, as Dylan was saying, each of the reviews was bespoke and driven by the question that was raised by the policy commissioners. So all of these reviews that we've done have been designed to meet the needs and concerns of policymakers, but they're also tailored around the available evidence, the resources that we have and the time available to do this. So in many senses, it's quite a pragmatic approach just to get beyond the understanding of intervention effectiveness, to get some explanation of how and why. And so she identified 4 different areas or categories of ways of combining the qualitative and quantitative. So combining different types of studies, qualitative and quantitative studies, but also combining different synthesis methods, also combining both primary and secondary level evidence, and also by combining both formal research evidence and some more informal data. And so in any given review, one or several combinations could be used. So using that as our basis, this is kind of what we mean by mixed method evidence synthesis, and why we'd want to undertake one. Some recent work that's I've been doing is to focus on what is it that we do at the stage where we're trying to integrate these different or diverse sets of evidence. So as Dylan was saying, these systematic reviews of intervention effects or quantitative evidence provide this robust evidence on outcomes of interventions, and the qualitative evidence synthesized can help us to generate theories or explanations for how and why. And this idea that what we need, we've got these 2 sets of evidence, it's the next stage. How do we bring those 2 sets of evidence together in order to explore reasons for variation in patterns of behaviours or intervention outcomes? And we find that this kind of approach offers that the information that policymakers are seeking, and decision makers and practitioners to be able to support the implementation of review findings in practice. And this work that I'm going to be describing now is chapter 14, or described in chapter 14 of the new Cochrane-Campbell Handbook for Evidence Synthesis that you may be aware of. It's free to access. You just need a Cochrane account, which is also free to register for a Cochrane account. And the web address is there. You can see, so I'm going to be talking about this chapter, integrating qualitative and quantitative evidence, but there is also a useful chapter on qualitative comparative analysis, because I expect, or I hope you'll be intrigued to find out more about that method once you've heard from Dylan. So those of you who have some familiarity with mixed method evidence synthesis know that there are a number of typologies in the literature which focus on a very high level around how different types of evidence are brought together, but not so much focused on integration. So through years of teaching and working with others, and we're seeing it in the literature as well, the details about specific techniques or procedures for integration are often missing or unclear. And that's what the chapter focuses on, this procedures for integration. And it covers 3 broad approaches. So the first assimilation is this idea of mixing all of the evidence together, regardless of its design, or whether it's qualitative and quantitative, so that it's all mixed together in a single approach. Much like a cocktail, you can't tell the individual ingredients of that cocktail anymore. Other approaches, so the comparison approach, keeps the 2 sets of evidence separate and juxtapose them to see what we can learn by putting the 2 sets of evidence side by side. And then the third approach is really to use one synthesis to inform how the other synthesis is undertaken. I'll tell you a little bit more about each of those approaches. So with this assimilation approach, the purpose that we can see typically from the literature, or its value, is increasing the pool of available evidence. So these are reviews, and they're commonly seen where it's typically designed to answer a single question. And we can infer there's an assumption here that all evidence, whether qualitative or quantitative, on a similar topic, can be used to address the same research questions, and so can be synthesized together. But in order to do that, one type of evidence would need to be transformed into the other type in order to enable the merger to happen. And most often what we see is this idea of qualitizing, so using evidence typically defined as quantitative, or studies typically defined as quantitative, and either extracting qualitative type evidence from them, or translating, for example, numerical data into words and or themes. The much more limited research or use of quantitizing, but there is some work out there by Van Brutel, although that's somewhat controversial, I would say, in the qualitative synthesis field. But one of the key limitations that I can see from this is that one of the key values for me is, or what I really value from doing mixed method synthesis, is harnessing the value of seeing a phenomenon from these two very different perspectives, the micro, the macro, the kind of rich contextual experience, and the larger and broader scale patterns. And you kind of lose that if you merge. So the second approach is comparing. So it's kind of keeping the integrity of the 2 different sets of evidence. They're synthesized separately and explore to examine different facets of the same phenomenon. And the assumption here is that the distinct methods and worldviews underpinning those different sets of evidence suggest that we can preserve that value much better if we synthesize them separately. And the idea here is to do these separate synthesis, and then to do kind of align them side by side so we can see what we can learn from each other. And in the literature, we're seeing 4 kind of broad ways that people have used for comparing the 2 sets of evidence. So in row A, we see qualitative evidence synthesis teams being compared in a matrix with the synthesized findings from an effectiveness review. And then in row B, the difference here, so again, it's using a matrix, again, it's comparing the QS themes, but the difference is that they are compared not with the synthesized findings, but individual interventions. And I'll give you an illustration of that in the next slide. The third row is where the QES work that's developed goes beyond themes to develop a much more higher level theory, which is illustrated in a logic model. And then the comparison happens when the effectiveness synthesis findings are kind of used to annotate that logic model to illustrate where there's evidence in support of the theory in different parts of the model. And then the final one is we've seen examples of where the qualitative and quantitative evidence are so discordant, it's very difficult to kind of lay them out side by side, either in a matrix or a logic model. And so a line of argument has been constructed. Again, in the chapter, there's much more detail on those, but I'll just give you an example of one approach. So this is aligned with the matrix in row B there. So comparing the themes from a qualitative synthesis with individual interventions. And you can see at the bottom of the diagram here is a list of themes, or 1 to 7, or implications derived from themes from a qualitative synthesis. So 1 being about providers needing training on the benefits of labour companion prior to implementation. 2, about women being educated about the benefits of labour companionship. So it's work from Megan Boren and others on labour companionship interventions. And you can see the table itself has each of those implications derived from the qualitative synthesis listed in each of the columns 1 to 7, and then each of the rows are a different intervention in the intervention effects review. And you can see that the bottom 3 interventions there, Dickinson, Gagnon and Hans, all have a Y in the column for factor 1. So we can see that those interventions involved training for providers on the benefits of labour companionship prior to implementation, where there's a question mark about all of the other interventions about whether that feature aligned with women's and experiences of labour companionship or not. But you can see, it's not all of the interventions in that review, it's just a snippet from the table, but you can begin to see the patterns in the way that the interventions do or don't align with the qualitative synthesis. So that's the comparison approach. Moving on then to the connection approach. Again, the connection approach, like the comparison approach, is designed to answer multiple questions, and the qualitative and quantitative evidence is synthesized separately. So it also preserves that integrity of the findings of these different types. But what distinguishes this is that the findings of one type of evidence, either qualitative or quantitative, inform and structure the synthesis of the other type. So it goes beyond that comparison approach and allows us to test. So not just see whether the interventions are aligned with QS theory, but we'd go one step beyond and see, for example, whether the interventions that are more effective are more aligned with the QS theory or not. And again, we see a number of forms of this type of synthesis. So we could use QS themes to inform subgroup analyses to test theories about whether they're interventions more aligned with the qualitative synthesis findings are more effective or not. Or we could use those QS themes to inform qualitative comparative analysis that Dylan will talk to you about shortly. We have seen just one example, and there may be more, but we found one example of the reverse, where the effectiveness synthesis that happens first and the findings of that are used to structure the way that the QS is undertaken. So I'm going to hand back now to Dylan to explain what we're talking about with the qualitative comparative analysis.
Great. So so we'll be using the acronym QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, just in this section. And this is just to give a bit of a flavour around one of the methods that we think works particularly well as a kind of connecting method. This is very much a whistle-stop tour. We do do training around QCA that does take, I think, well, day and a half, 2 days usually. So I'll try to cover it in 5 minutes. So bear with us. So QCA, we often use this as a way of connecting different types of data. We use it, the findings of one synthesis to inform the conduct and focus of another. And we keep this kind of separation in a way because we assume that the different data have different properties and that they require different approaches, but that we can still use the findings from one synthesis to shape and inform the other. And there's an increasing number of examples of reviews that have used QCA now, and some examples of designs here. So where a qualitative evidence synthesis has informed a QCA, and that's an example here from the work of GJ Melendez-Torres and Katie and colleagues who looked at weight management interventions, or where a QCA has informed the design of a meta-analysis. And so an example here is a Cochrane review by Catherine Harris and colleagues that looked at school-based asthma interventions. And sometimes there are more than or multiple synthesis methods, and QCA is used to make the connection between different synthesis methods as well. So a kind of qualitative evidence synthesis, a QCA, and then a meta-analysis. So it can be used in different ways, but tends to be used in this kind of connecting way. And what we do with QCA is that we try to understand and form a kind of causal recipe to understand the features of interventions and what makes them work and what may be redundant features of interventions. And we do this through identifying combinations of intervention features and contextual features that are either present or absent when an intervention is effective or ineffective in obtaining a desired outcome. And for those who may be more quant-orientated in thinking, it does require quite a change in thinking. And even for those who are qual-orientated, again, it requires a change in, logic. QCA has its own terminology. So, for example, in QCA terminology, what we would refer to as a study in a systematic review is a case, and the logic of QCA is that it is case-based rather than variable-based, and it requires developing a deep holistic understanding of each study so that you understand the intervention components, features, processes, and context. The logic of QCA is also drawn from set theoretic logic, where we seek to understand groupings of studies as sets, distinguished by having different components in the case of interventions and having different levels of effectiveness. So a set of successful interventions or effective interventions and a set of ineffective or unsuccessful interventions. And we try to explore the types of features and overlaps between these different sets. Within QCA, it's really important to draw on existing theory because of the type of causal narrative that we're trying to develop with QCA. And we're particular advocates of QCA within the EPPI Centre. QCA was developed and spearheaded, I should say, in the context of systematic reviews by our colleagues James Thomas, Ginny Brinton and Alison Mara Eves. And since then, we've been particular fans of QCA within the EPPI Centre because there are particular strengths. Two of these are that we can, QCA allows for the recognition of different pathways to a successful intervention. So it kind of allows for the complexity of the real world that complex interventions may look slightly different, but they may have common intervention features and they may be these kind of different pathways to an effective, intervention. The second property that is really interesting about QCA is that it allows for the recognition that sometimes intervention components are only effective or essentially activated in the presence of another intervention component. So, for example, in the case of school-based asthma interventions, the education may only be effective in the presence of an effective deliverer, an effective teacher. So it's not just about the curriculum, it's about the way it's delivered as well. Within QCA, within systematic reviews, we tend to look for sufficient relationships. And by this, we mean that we have a set of effective studies and we see a set of interventions that share a particular combination of characteristics as being a subset of that larger effective intervention set, as is depicted on the figure on the right here. So we have our successful intervention set, and in this example, as a subset, as a sufficient relationship, we have a set of studies allowing freedom of expression. So we can see here, when we see a set of studies that allow freedom of expression as an intervention component, we would expect that set of studies to be successful. However, we can also see that there's a lot of the outcome that is not explained. So we can expect there to be different pathways to lead to that successful intervention as well. QCA has a number of different steps and it has its own language. And as I say, working through these steps, we've taken 2 days and longer. So I'm not going to talk through each of these steps here, but I guess working through these steps does really help to orientate you as a reviewer in the thinking of QCA. And the other thing just to highlight here is that you'll notice that there's a lot of arrows kind of working sequentially through the steps, but there are also some dashed arrows going backwards, and it is a very kind of inductive and abductive approach to trying to find the optimal solution. We've used it across a different range of different reviews. So an example here is a review looking at social isolation and loneliness. We were looking at the experiences of older people during the pandemic, and we wanted to know more about effective online interventions for older adults that could help offset the risk of social isolation and loneliness. We used ICA intervention component analysis that Katie will talk about in a second to identify the processes that were theoretically important, and then explored QCA to really test how those processes stacked up alongside each other. And we really like QCA because it's really useful in giving a clear steer to decision makers on common features that are found in successful interventions. And so we've kind of gone right from the problem or the challenge, social isolation, loneliness among older people, right through the solution here, and worked through those steps. And we came to this solution, and we've got a kind of, on the left here, we've got 3 processes that we found were consistent across successful interventions. So studies had to have intimacy, they had to allow participants to get to know each other and form close relationships, had to have an element of interaction, so there was a common basis for having a relationship among the participants, and had to offer support, so there was a kind of element of pastoral care for the participants. And studies that had all 3 of these conditions simultaneously were those that were in the successful intervention group. And so in this output, we can see what those features are. We get a measure of the strength of the relationship, the consistency of the relationship. We have a measure of coverage, so how many instances of success we've explained. And then we get an indication of which of the studies in the review follow that causal recipe. And within QCA, we then go back and we look at the interpretation, drawing on individual studies. In this case, we're looking at interaction, and we've got an example from a study from Torp and colleagues, and interaction was this kind of shared basis for forming social relationships. And you can see here that interaction made it easier for participants to be together. They felt they had more to talk about when there was an element to support that interaction. They had a shared characteristic. We found that all 7 of the most effective interventions had this component, and none of the least effective interventions had this component. We feel that QCA is really useful in helping to identify the critical features of interventions where other approaches have been unsuccessful. They really help to unpick a kind of causal recipe around why an intervention can lead to a successful outcome for participants. And we've found that decision makers are quite responsive to the idea of having a kind of causal recipe, having a kind of design specification for an intervention or a policy. There are some limitations, and we're aware of these. In particular, poor intervention reporting is a hindrance to QCA, and there are limitations around the extent and the type of causal narrative that we assemble when we're conducting QCA. But we found that it's a really useful approach, and there are some new resources. So there's the Cochrane Handbook for Qualitative Evidence Synthesis Methods chapter, and there's also a new tool for critical appraisal and reviews using QCA, Carry QCA, that will be submitted for publication shortly. And I'm going to hand back to Katie, who's going to just talk through the final method, which is ICA, intervention and analysis.
Thank you, Dylan. So ICA and QCA are both, I think, methods that we feel sort of transcend the whole quant divide. So both of these methods are kind of looking at evidence from trials, but using elements of qualitative methods and techniques. And the particular review that Dylan's just described, in fact, as well as these two methods being sort of transcending or being mixed methods, if you like, in and of themselves, so using qualitative techniques within a kind of study design that's typically defined as quantitative, these methods can be used in conjunction with, in comparison or connection approaches with other methodological types. So the QCA that Dylan just described was informed by an ICA, but it could equally have been informed by a QES. But just to kind of illustrate what I mean here in terms of ICA, just going back to the review in which we developed it. So with all of this work, all of this mixed method work, as we've been saying, it's driven by the kinds of questions that we're presented with by policymakers, what they need and the kind of concerns they're trying to address. So we've been asked to do an effectiveness review on interventions to reduce medication error in children. And one of the interventions we've been looking at was pediatric electronic prescribing tools. And overall, our synthesis showed that these kind of electronic prescribing tools showed benefits. But within the set of studies, we had a couple of studies with quite concerning harmful effects, including one with an increase in mortality among children following the implementation of electronic prescribing. So it sort of really brings home, I think, that point around needing to understand the mechanisms of action. So for the Department of Health and Social Care to proceed to developing policy and practice based on this, needed to understand how to harness the benefits whilst avoiding the harms. And in this review, so I said we've done the effectiveness synthesis and we didn't have sufficient time or resources to go on to conduct a qualitative evidence synthesis and then an integration. So we developed this pragmatic response. So we applied qualitative methods, so inductive thematic analysis or synthesis and line-by-line coding, and applied it to the trials. So we both use these techniques to look at the nature of the interventions and to extract trialists' experiences of implementing an intervention. So we're using qualitative techniques and trial reports. And QCA has two main steps. So the first step aims to understand what variation there is across the interventions in the review in terms of the intervention, implementation, and contextual features. And we use two methods. So we inductively code or the intervention descriptions, and then we inductively code these authors' reflections about the strengths and limitations of those features. And then in stage 2, we move to try to examine whether the differences that we've observed between the interventions from stage 1 appear to explain the differences in the outcomes. So we create a matrix displaying the features of the interventions and examine that in relation to patterns in the outcomes of those interventions. So it's moving somewhat beyond that kind of comparative approach that we saw in the Megan Boram's work on birthing companions, but it's not quite as formalized. It's certainly not as formalized as the QCA approach that Dylan just described. And the reason we use this kind of qualitative approach for capturing the features of interventions, again, is to do with these problems in intervention reporting that Dylan noted. We often get limited detail, inconsistent descriptors, and different elements of the intervention emphasised or not across the different studies. And so we find that the qualitative approach is useful for overcoming that and being able to broadly categorise and describe the interventions. And then the capturing of authors' views and reflections gives us, although it's not formal research data, it does allow us to tap into these real-world experiences of delivering the intervention. And so in stage 2, this kind of assessment of whether patterns in similarities and differences across the interventions map on to effectiveness is illustrated here. So these two studies are ones where we saw these unfortunately harmful outcomes for children, and you can see looking at the columns that neither of these interventions was specifically designed for use in paediatrics, and they both had very limited what we call front end support, and they're very, quite qualitatively different from most of the other interventions in this set of studies. So we can begin to tentatively theorise that those are important features of interventions. So as I was saying at the start of this, ICA can be considered a mixed methods approach in its own right, using qualitative techniques and methods within evidence that's typically considered quantitative, but it can also be integrated with other methods. And coming back to the top of the session where Dylan was talking about causal certainty, the uncertainty we have when using qualitative research and some of these methods means that we recommend using ICA alongside other methods. So in the example that Dylan was sharing on social isolation and loneliness, certainly it was true that the ICA informed the QCA meta-analysis, but it actually was also underpinned by existing mid-range theory in its own right. So there's a lot going on in there. So it's coming back to this idea of mixed method research being creative and responsive and in some ways pragmatic. We've kind of used a whole range of different approaches and brought a different range of things together. So I'll hand back to Dylan just to wrap up.
Great. So I guess just very quickly before opening up for questions, we just wanted to kind of share some final thoughts. And I think Katie just hits on it then. So we don't have a kind of a blueprint for conducting mixed methods. We really are responsive to the types of questions that are being asked and to try to think through the kind of balance of the aims and the purpose, and then think about the kind of available evidence and the kind of questions. We inevitably need to tailor our approaches. It feels like every mixed methods review that we undertake requires adaptation, innovation, and I think that speaks to this area being inherently creative. And there's lots of kind of examples of creativity in the literature, and I think this is a really fertile space, and that it's exciting in a way to think through what else is possible and what we might see in the future. We have some resources as well that we can share, and we just wanted to thank you for listening and just acknowledge some of the people involved in developing these resources and our thinking around this. So James, Alison, Angela, and we'll stop there and just check if there are any questions. Thank you.